So we keep hearing how divided our country is, and there's a lot of theories as to how we got here. But our next guest, well, he gets down to the crux of it, I think. Tim Carney, he is a columnist at Washington Examiner, author of the book Alienated America. Tim, always good to talk to you, my friend. Thanks for being here.
Thank you.
There's a lack of faith in this country. You detail it in the book Alienated America. You write about it quite a bit in your columns at Washington Examiner. When we as a nation, as a culture, when we started to lose faith, we started to find those critical needs in other places, and politics, sadly, has become one of those places. Am I summarizing your thesis here properly?
That's definitely part of it. I mean, sometimes we think we're becoming a secular country, and there's ways in which that's definitely true. Very fewer people go to church or synagogue or mosque on a given weekend. Fewer people belong to organized religion. But in some ways, the word secular is misleading. As you suggested there, we find our meaning and our belonging elsewhere. And humans are tribal. Sometimes people say, oh, we're too tribalistic now. We've always been tribal. The question is, are our tribes healthy tribes that are grounded in, service of others, tradition, pursuit of higher purpose, or are they more brutal tribes that are grounded just in sort of power, advancement of the self, race, anything like that? And I think a huge part of what's happened in America, and what I talk about in Alienated America and in my columns at the Examiner, et cetera, is that we are losing these older senses of meaning, and we're replacing them with other things, which include whether you're a Republican or a Democrat, whether you wear a red MAGA hat or a pink knit kitty cat hat, to make a 2021 reference or 2017 reference, and that's at the root of our problems.
Yeah, the important thing is each side has their own hat. That's critically important. So I'm glad we've worked that out. But listen, it's easy to immediately take this examination that you've laid out here and start talking about the left, because I think that the left, generally speaking, is a little more secular. So it's like, oh, if we lost our faith, that must mean the left.
Yes.
We'll get to them in a minute. But this is a phenomenon, I think, within our conservative ranks as well. I'm a Catholic, and I consume a lot of Catholic media, Catholic podcasts, Catholic columns. I'm struck sometimes about how much of the conversation within the religious faithful, and by the way, Meredith, my wife, is a Southern Baptist. Same thing is going on quite a bit with the Southern Baptist Convention. How much of their discussion is not about theology, and not about doctrine, not about salvation. It's about domestic politics. It's sort of infiltrated our churches as well. Even if you do have faith, your faith is shot through the lens of your political perspective.
No, that's exactly right. And neither you or I would ever say, first I'm going to say what we're not saying. We're not saying the Catholic Church should drop its opposition to abortion. Okay, that's rooted in the fundamental teachings. But it can't. But what I'm saying is that if your sort of religious content has to do with, the Senate race in Ohio, then that's not religious content.
Right.
And I've been to some of these churches in Iowa leading up to the caucuses, and it's one thing, and as a Catholic, it rubs me wrong when, a candidate, even one I really like, a Rick Santorum, goes up on stage, but during Sunday service, but then you see the rest of the service sort of sounds a little more like everyday politics, like you're watching Fox or CNN, and that's sort of taking the sacred and sort of throwing it off the cliff and replacing it with the day-to-day. But sort of the demographics that I've looked at in my research, and the studies have to do with the fact that Christian conservatives are becoming less attached to religious institutions, and they are attending less. That is, religiosity there's a lot of different ways to measure it, but one of the key ways in which we're dropping is just attendance. Do you show up? Do you spend part of your Sunday, your Saturday with other people? Do you spend are you building up communities? Do you belong to something bigger than yourself?
Yeah.
And that's where we're really dropping off. And those people are the people who are least likely to get married, most susceptible. The people not attending are the people most susceptible to fall for conspiracy theories, to fall into a sort of extremism. So the left used to worry about the religious right. And I'm saying, you know what? You're really not going to like the post-religious right. Even if they identify as religious, if they don't belong to a church community, that's where we're going to find all sorts of alienation, isolation, and the problems that that causes.
You know, one other, I want to pull on that thread just a little bit more before we do get to the secular left, because I think that that's a whole separate conversation. But you mentioned this. If you're not attending services, Bible studies on a regular basis, if you're not integrating with people that have your faith in common, that also sort of alienates us that much more, because one of the things about the sanctuary of a religious service, and I use that term, you know, in every both entendre that I can, because you would be in that sanctuary, you would, yes, be focusing on your faith, and the person worshiping next to you could very well be a liberal Democrat. And that's okay, because you have this other thing, this more important, grander thing in common. And it makes it a lot less difficult, I think, or it makes it more difficult, I should say, to then, you know, go after some Democrat on your Facebook page if you know that Democrat that you're going after could very well be sitting in the pews next to you this Sunday.
No, and there's tons of sociology to back this up much more broadly than just politics. And again, this is a lesson for the people who are afraid of the religious right. White conservative Christians who go to church have warmer attitude towards immigrants and other racial minorities. Think of the average person you see at church. They're not a racist person at all.
Yeah.
But the places where you do see less warm attitudes towards immigrants and racial minorities is among those that don't go to church. And so it just broadly broadens your heart and broadens your mind to belong to a faith community. And that's why everybody should be worried that more people don't belong to any at all.
All right, that's our introspection within our conservative faith-based community. Now
we get to own the left.
Let's examine the left, because I mean it's not breaking new ground here. They have become more secularized on the American left. I believe the largest religious group identified as registered Democrats are atheists. So are we looking at this phenomenon here, the G.K. Chesterton phenomenon? It's not that if you're an atheist, you won't believe in nothing, you'll believe in anything. They're founding their faith. Their faith is in secular politics, environmentalism, LGBTQ doctrine and dogma. That's what we're seeing over there?
Yeah, there's always going to be a sacred in 95% of human hearts. And right now, what you're seeing with the transgender ideology, and even with things that sort of have more rational roots, such as, you know, the Black Lives Matter thing, how that transformed into being a quasi religious movement there. Mm-hmm. But you're seeing it in environmentalism. Environmentalism is so obviously about faith and not works. The United States has done more than 90% of countries to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but because we don't profess the faith that they do at the Paris Accords, et cetera, that we are somehow the heathens. And so I look at public schools too. When I was in public schools in New York State in the 1990s, there was this effort to be like totally relativistic. There is no truth. But that's a self-contradictory philosophy. So it gave way to a new philosophy, and the public schools are religious schools now. And their religion, you could call it wokeism, all sorts of things, but that's what we're seeing on the left.
Well, and it's a very less tolerant faith, frankly, than a Judeo-Christian faith that actually opens a dialogue up for non-believers or people who might have a different approach to the faith. Just a minute left here, but it would be remiss of us to also not talk about the new religion of science that we saw really hit home with the COVID-19 pandemic. That's part of this as well, isn't it?
Yeah, faith in science is so misplaced. I remember at once somebody was like, oh, I'm glad Sweden is doing the COVID response differently. That way it's real science. We'll have different ways of approaching this, and then in the end we'll test our hypotheses and see the results. And the response was, that's not science, that's denying science, because they think what Anthony Fauci said was sort of dogma that can't be questioned.
Yeah.
Science is great. Science and religion go together hand in hand, but when science becomes a religion, then it stops being science.
Yeah, Fauci infallibility was a real problem there that we just couldn't get past. And well beyond whether he was speaking ex cathedra or not. Tim Carney, we got to leave it there. But listen, I love this. Instead of just decrying how separated we are and divided we are, and instead of wallowing in it, I want to examine how we got here and maybe actually come up with solutions how we can fix it. So you're going to be a part of that conversation here, and I appreciate you joining us. More to come on O'Connor Tonight.